Key bowl. The bowl had been her sister's idea, back when the bakery still felt like a hopeful thing instead of a job that clung to her clothes. A kindness, her sister had called it. Somewhere for people to drop the stray keys they picked up in, parking lots or under cafe tables, the way folks already left buttons or loose screws on the counter for her, like she ran some kind of small-town lost and found. It was a plain white cereal bowl, chipped along one rim where it had slipped from a moving box years back. Claire washed it, set it beside the register, and propped a handwritten card behind it that said found keys in her looping script. The first week it held a couple house keys and half a padlock clasp. Ordinary things, the sort of metal bits that turned up in a place where people dug through purses and pockets to pay. By the time the second week crawled around, the bowl was almost full. She did not see anyone drop them in. No apologetic nods or sheepish laughs. No teenagers rolling keys off their knuckles and pretending they were not nervous. The keys just appeared. One moment the bowl was holding the same handful she knew by feel. The next there was another flat glint of metal wedged between the others, like a coin that had grown overnight. None of them had tags. That was the part that settled somewhere low in her stomach. No colored sleeves, no paper labels with faded addresses. Every key was bare and soft around the edges, the cuts worn smooth. They looked like they had been turned in a lot of locks for a long time, and then turned in none at all. She asked customers in a casual way at first. Anyone lose a key? Anyone missing a whole ring? Usually people patted pockets, checked the tops of their wallets, then shrugged. Folks laughed and said that was the sort of thing that would drive them crazy, not knowing what a key belonged to. They took their bread and their coffee, and they left, the bell over the door chiming behind them. The bowl filled anyway. At closing time one night, she carried it to the back room and sat down at the little staff table. There was a hum from the refrigerators that never really stopped. A soft radio hiss from the old speaker someone had left on the top shelf, and the faint ticking of cooling metal as ovens gave up their heat. She spread a dish towel, turned the bowl over, and poured the keys out in a dull spill. She sorted them into little piles, more for the feeling of doing something than any real plan. Long ones, stubby ones, the ones with round heads, the ones with those square shoulders. Some looked like the cheap brass kind hardware stores cut while you waited. Some were silver, some darker. None of them had anything printed on them but the faint stamp of the manufacturer, which did not help much. She tried one in the back door. It did not even enter the keyway, just scraped and stuck. Another in the office door. Another in the walk-in fridge. All the wrong mouths for all the wrong teeth. After a while, the game made her feel foolish, like a child dressing dolls that did not fit in their clothes. You could take them to the police station, her sister had said over the phone when Claire mentioned it, or to the grocery service desk. Someone might report something. She had tried that. The officer on duty had shrugged and said people were always losing things. The woman at the store had nodded, eyes already tracking the next customer. The keys came back home with her in their white bowl, riding in the passenger seat like a passenger that refused to get out. Soon she stopped asking. She scooped them back into the bowl, set the bowl by the register each morning, and pretended not to hear when more joined them. Sometimes it was a faint clink during the busy hours, buried under the coin rattle and card machine chime. Sometimes it came during the dead stretch between the morning rush and the lunchtime slump, when the street outside was empty and the only sounds were the fridge hum and the low swirl of air through the vents. She would be wiping down the counter or counting the stacks of takeaway cups when the bowl chimed softly. A single sound and then silence. Every time she looked up, the spoon she kept there for stirring sugar was still, nothing moving. The bell over the door barely stirred. A truck might pass outside, but no one stood near the register. She told herself it was the bowl settling, or the old counter warping under the weight. Houses made noises, so did businesses. Older wood moved with the weather. There were plenty of reasons for a small sound in a quiet room. She said this in her head and sometimes out loud. The words felt blunt but sturdy, like the dough scraper she used on the workbench. One morning after a storm had rolled through in the night and left the street outside striped with wet and dry, she came in and turned on the lights and found her own spare key lying on the counter beside the register. It sat a little apart from the bowl. Not much, just the distance of a hand width. She saw it as soon as she reached for the till. Her hand stopped halfway, air cooling the damp flour on her fingers. She stared at the key. She knew it instantly. The shape of it, the little notch at the head where she had once caught it on a nail. The faint amount of red paint smeared along one edge from when she had carried it loose in a pocket while repainting her kitchen. It was the spare to her front door at home, the one she kept in a magnet box under the railing behind her trash bin. Claire did not move for a long breath. The hum from the fridge stacked against the far wall felt louder, a steady throat clearing through the room. The overhead light was a touch slow, warming to its full brightness. She reached for the key. The metal felt dry and faintly cool, no condensation from the damp morning air. She sat it in her palm, thumb across the cuts, and felt a sudden, foolish shame at how her heart was knocking. Maybe she had taken it out of the box herself and forgotten. Maybe she had needed it yesterday, though she could not remember why. Maybe she had set it down, and some customer had been honest enough to put it in plain sight. There was a flour smear along one edge that had not been there before. Claire turned it over. White dust sat in the grooves, tucked into the little valleys, like someone had pressed it against the workbench. She wiped it clean on her apron, set it down, and lifted the bowl. The bowl was full again. However many keys had been in it at closing time yesterday, there were more now. The topmost ones rounded up like a hill, just shy of spilling. She did not remember the last time she had looked in and truly counted. Somewhere along the line, she had stopped trying to keep track. The keys had become like the bags of flour stacked in the dry room, like the cartons of eggs in the cooler. Always there, always enough. She set her spare key among them. It slid down the small slope, settling between two others. Claire listened without intending to. The sound it made was small and final, the kind of sound you might never notice if you were not waiting for it. For the rest of the day, she caught herself glancing at the bowl more than she meant to. Her hands remembered the turns of work while her head wandered back toward it. The dough rose, the oven timers buzzed, the front door opened and closed. People came in damp from the lingering drizzle, their shoes squeaking on the mat. She smiled. Filled orders made idle talk about the weather. The bowl sat there in the corner of her vision. In the middle of the afternoon, when there was a lull so long the clock on the back wall sounded louder with each tick, the bell over the door gave a half-hearted jingle and stopped. No one came in. The door had not moved. Still, she heard that small metallic throat clear, that single clink from beside the register. She wiped her hands, rounded the counter, and stared down. Somewhere in the crush of brass and silver, another key had joined. She could not have said which. It felt as if trying to find a new raindrop on a wet window. She closed up early that night. The air had a slant to it, the sky over the town smeared with low clouds that caught and held the sodium streetlights. Claire flipped chairs onto tables, swept the day's crumbs into a small pile that looked like a pale island, and dragged the mop along the floor until the water in the bucket turned the color of weak coffee. She did the money count, slid the drawer shut, and stood in front of the front door with a deadbolt key in her hand. For a while, she just looked at the lock. It glared back, brass scuffed from years of use, a small circle in a world that had grown full of them. Then she went back to the register, lifted the bowl, and picked up the key she knew was hers. It lay where she had left it, That at least was something. In the quiet of an empty shop, the split second of sound as she pried it free felt much louder. She walked back to the door, slipped the deadbolt key into her apron pocket, and held the spare up to the lock. "This is stupid," she thought. "It is a piece of metal. You are tired." The key slid in with no resistance at all. There was a hitch in her breath. She pressed the heel of her hand against the door, gave the key a careful twist. She expected it to jam halfway, to stop with that harsh, familiar bite when teeth did not match pins. Instead, the cylinder turned smooth and easy, like it had been waiting for this. The deadbolt shifted. Nothing else happened. The street outside stayed where it was. The dark shape of the newspaper box, the empty sidewalk, the narrow slice of other storefronts. Claire swallowed and backed away. For a moment, she stood in the middle of the little seating area, listening to the fridge hum and the faint fizz of the light. Then she stepped back up to the door and pushed it open. The town was gone. It took her a second to understand that. The street beyond the glass was not the street she knew. The sidewalk was still there, but it looked washed out, as if someone had left it in the sun too long. The air beyond the threshold smelled different, wetter and colder, damp with something that did not match the weather she had left outside. She did not step through. Her hand stayed tight on the inside handle, knuckles pale. The other hand still held the key in the lock, her fingers numb along the thin metal neck. The parking space directly in front of the bakery was empty. No cars, not even the oil stain that had been there as long as she could remember. Across what should have been the road, buildings stood in a line that almost matched the ones she knew, but they were not quite right. Too tall or too narrow, their windows dark and blank. There were no signs, no posters in the glass, no peel of tape where someone had taken something down. Light fell from somewhere she could not see. It had the color of late afternoon after rain, that washed, silvery tone, but there was no sky above, just a pale haze. The sound from the refrigerators seemed to follow her out, as if the noise had wrapped itself around her and was now breathing against the back of her neck. She smelled yeast and something else that tugged at memory. Whetstone, maybe, or the inside of a cellar. Claire stepped back. The soles of her shoes caught the threshold. She could feel the boundary like a temperature line at the edge of a draft. She pulled the door closed and locked it again, first with the spare, then with a regular key. When the latch caught, she eased the spare back out, held it in her hand for a heartbeat longer, and walked it back to the bowl. She did not pour it in. She set it gently on the top, where it lay across the others like a slender bridge. Then she shut off the lights, grabbed her coat, and went out the back way. At home, she checked the magnet box under the railing. Her fingers scraped paint and rust and came up empty. She sat down hard on the back step and let the cool air raise bumps along her forearms. On the drive the next morning, the radio poured out talk she did not hear. Her mind kept turning over the wrong street, the sky that was not a sky, the feeling of a boundary at her feet. By the time she pulled around behind the bakery and parked, she had almost convinced herself that it had been a trick of light, a tired brain misreading an ordinary scene. She walked in through the back. The place smelled like it always did at that hour. Flour, old coffee from the pot she never quite remembered to rinse, sugar, a faint tang of yeast from the sourdough starter that lived in its plastic tub. Her apprentice, a quiet college kid named Rhea, would not be in until later. There was no reason for anyone to have touched the front door, the bowl, the keys. The register counter was exactly where she had left it. The bowl sat beside it. It was full again. The keys stood rim high, jostling for room, pressing against the chipped edge as if they were trying to climb out. Claire set her bag down. Her heart gave one solid kick. She looked for her spare. It was there, somewhere in the mix. She could not find it, not by sight alone. They all looked alike now. her key with its faint red smear lost in a world of metal. When Rhea came in, hanging her jacket on the same peg she always used, Claire heard her say, "Hey," in the usual sleepy way. Claire answered, kept her tone light, said something about how they were going to need another sack of flour sooner than she thought. Rhea nodded, tied on an apron, and went to the back to start shaping rolls. The day went on. Orders came and went. A bell above the door chimed, sometimes in quick little bursts, sometimes with long hesitations between, like the town buying its bread had its own breath. People ordered their usuals. A few asked about the storm, about the flicker in the power overnight. Someone mentioned a missing dog. Someone else said they had heard about a break-in on the far side of the main road. Claire answered, or pretended to, but part of her stayed by the register. Every time someone reached for their wallet, every time a hand brushed near the bowl, she watched. No one dropped anything in. No one even seemed to see the keys. Their eyes slid past the bowl like it was not there. Only twice did she hear the small, solitary clink that meant another had joined. Weeks folded over each other. The town moved along the way it always had, in its slow, stubborn rhythm. Trucks rumbled down the main road. School buses wheezed at the intersections. On certain days, the smell from the feed mill drifted across and made people wrinkle their noses as they drank their coffee. In the bakery, the small things shifted. Claire began to notice the patterns. On a Tuesday, an older woman came in, the type who always wore the same soft cardigan no matter the weather. She patted at her coat, then at her purse, face tightening. She said she must have mislaid her house key again. Claire watched her check and recheck pockets that did not give anything back. There was a clink from the bowl, so soft that if a truck had passed, just then she would not have heard it at all. Claire waited until the woman left with her bread. Then she turned toward the bowl. Another key sat near the top now, stilling as she watched. It looked like all the others, blank and warm. When she reached for it, her fingers shook. She chose another night to test it. Closing time had always been her favorite. Back when she first opened the bakery, those last moments of the day had meant a kind of quiet satisfaction, a sense of having done what needed doing. Now they felt like a narrowing. The chairs went upside down on the tables, their metal legs sticking up like brittle plants. The mop wrapped its own smell around the floor. The air cooled. The outside world thinned to a strip of street and a couple of far-off porch lights. She locked the back and stood in front of the front door with the key from the bowl in her hand. The old fear was there again, but there was something else underneath it now, a tug that felt almost like curiosity. The world beyond the glass was the ordinary night street, the newspaper box, the trash barrel, the faint smear of light from the bar at the corner. When she turned the lock with the day's key and opened the door, that world was what greeted her. She closed it and locked it again. Then she slipped the bowl key into the lock. It turned as smoothly as the spare had. No resistance, no scrape. The cylinder moved like it had always known this key, like this was its native cut. She did not open the door at once. She stood with her forehead close to the glass, breathing a thin cloud onto it. Through that cloud the street blurred, then cleared again. She swallowed, braced, and pushed. She was in the bakery, not the one she had left behind her just now, with the chairs up and the mop leaning in its bucket. Another bakery that almost matched it, but was missing small things. The tables stood upright, their chairs still on the floor. The lights overhead were dimmer, turned low to a glow that painted everything in soft warmth. The ovens along the back wall shone, their doors closed, their glass windows lit with a muted orange that did not seem to give off heat. The air held the smell of bread as if it had just come out of the oven, a deep yeasty note that made the back of her mouth water. On every empty hook, every rail where she usually hung trays and pans, keys dangled. They caught the low light and turned it into a fretwork of dull sparks. Some hung alone on a hook, some in small clusters, their edges just brushing. They were still, but not quite. Now and then one gave a faint sway, the way a rope might move if someone had just climbed it and let go. The bowl by the register sat empty. Claire realized her hand was still on the door handle. Behind her, the town she knew was present only as pressure against her back, a cooler air coming in through the crack around the jamb. Ahead, the sounds were not quite the ones she expected. The refrigerator hummed, though the pitch of it was off, like a song played in the wrong key. Something ticked, not the clock on the wall, but something closer, like fingernails on a metal shelf. Her heart said close the door and walk away. Her feet took one step inside. The threshold had the same feel as before, that slight change in temperature. The floor under her shoes was the same dull tile she had scrubbed 1,000 times. She could see the faint black scuff mark near the front table, where a kid's shoe had left its mark weeks back. The register sat in its spot, the drawer closed, the tape showing the last sale if she leaned far enough to read it. This is a trick, she thought. A reflection, maybe. Some odd loop your brain has made. She did not quite believe herself. She walked in far enough for the door to close behind her. It did so with a soft click that felt final. The faint hiss of the light deepened. The air around the ovens shimmered, but when she held her hand near the glass, the heat she expected was not there. The glow was all color, no warmth. The keys on the racks did not move, but the sense of motion clung to them like static. Claire lifted her hand, hesitated, then plucked the closest key from its hook. The ring it hung on was cold. The key itself looked no different than any others she had seen that day. It might have been one from the bowl, might have been one from some other bowl in some other town where a tired baker watched the street. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in her palm, and tried to imagine its lock. When she hung it back where she had found it, it gave a faint tremor. Not the kind that comes from being touched. More like a shiver running down through metal, whispered from key to key along the row. The sound of humming came from somewhere beyond the back room. Not mechanical, not human, quite. A low tone, like someone softly holding a note at the far end of an empty hallway. She stepped away from the racks and picked a path back to the door. Her pulse had moved from her throat to the back of her eyes. When she reached the threshold and turned the lock with her hand, it gave under her palm, eager to open. She stumbled back into her own dim bakery, the very particular smell of her mop water hitting her face. The chairs were still up. The bucket still stood where she had left it. The bowl at the register was full. She relocked the door with her regular key. Then she dug the bowl key out of her pocket, walked it over, and dropped it in. The sound it made when it met the others was small and satisfied. For a few nights after that, she did not touch the keys again. She went through her routines, clung to the small markers of normal life. The early mornings, when the sky still had that ink blue over the roofs. The quiet afternoon hours, when she wiped crumbs from the corners and checked expiration dates on cartons. The way Rhea showed up with coffee from the place on the next block, her hair always pulled up in a messy knot. Still, the bowl waited. It sat no differently than it always had, but she felt its presence now the way she felt the tick in the wall or a slightly off smell from the drains. Something to track, even while her hands were busy. The rest of the town started to slide out of its usual groove at the same time. Little things. The flyer on the community board about a man who had gone missing after his night shift at the mill. The woman who said her mailbox key no longer fit, even though the landlord swore no one had changed the lock. The teenager who came in complaining that the key to his car had snapped right off in the ignition. Claire listened with half an ear. Her hands wrapped pastries in paper, poured coffee, slid plates across the counter. Whenever someone talked about a key or about getting locked out, she would hear a small delayed chime from the bowl. She told herself it was coincidence. Of course people would lose keys. this far out where houses were still held together with old locks and hope. Of course, people would talk about it. Of course, her brain would tie the sounds together. That was what brains did. But on the morning, when the landlord came by with a clipboard and a contract, she could not keep part of her from thinking about the bowl. He stood at the front counter, his bulky jacket unzipped, a sheen of cold air still clinging to him. He tapped the stack of papers with a thick finger. "We are updating all the locks," he said. "New security, new standards, the whole line about keeping businesses safer. New keys, of course. You will get yours once the change is done." The bowl sat to his right, full to its chipped lip. He did not look at it. His eyes moved from her face to the register. Behind him, the street sprawled in its usual narrow way, trucks passing in slow procession. Claire wiped her hands on her apron. The flower made ghost prints along the blue fabric. "Is that really necessary?" she asked. "The locks have worked fine." He shrugged. "Insurance reasons," he said. "You know how it is. Can you be here late next week after closing to let the locksmith in?" The locksmith, she thought. A stranger with new metal in a bag. "I am here late most nights anyway," she said. She signed the paper. The pen left a faint indentation where her name ran a little too hard. The landlord nodded, told her the approximate evening, and left, the bell giving one last jangle as the door shut behind him. When she turned, the bowl gave a single little sound. The days between the notice and the night stretched. She tried to treat them like any others. She kneaded dough, rotating the bowls until the gluten did its slow alchemy under her hands. She baked, the ovens breathing out even warmth. She scraped racks, washed trays, rolled silverware into napkins. Her sleep thinned. She woke in the dark part of the night with the feeling that she needed to check something important, then lay there trying to remember what it was. Once she got up and drove in, shoes barely tied, only to find the bakery silent and exactly as she had left it. Still, every time she entered, she checked the bowl first. Each time it was full. Not overflowing, never quite that, but exactly full. Keys sitting flush with the rim, as if some rule she did not know kept them from spilling over. Sometimes she would take a few out, just to see. When she returned later, they would be back to that same rounded level again. On an afternoon when rain ran in thin sheets down the front windows, blurring the parked cars and the slow trickle of shoppers, she found herself alone in the front room. Rhea was in the back restocking the walk-in. The only noise was the steady patter of water and the tired rotation of the ceiling fan. Claire moved to the register and picked a key at random. It came from near the bottom this time, buried among the others. She had to wiggle it free. The sound of metal rubbing metal set her teeth on edge. When she finally lifted it, a faint dark mark showed on the head, a little crescent where it had rested against another for a long time. She held it in her palm and tried to imagine its door. The shape of the cuts on its blade made her think of a narrow lock, the sort on an apartment mailbox slot. She thought of neat rows of boxes in a lobby somewhere, names printed on tiny slips of paper, some crossed out and rewritten, some empty. Back when she was younger and first moved to town, she had lived in a place like that above the laundromat, the whole building smelling of detergent and damp clothes. Then, the key to the box downstairs had meant something. It had meant letters, bills, a life addressed to her. She closed her fingers around the key and walked toward the back. The bakery's back door was a plain steel slab with a small square window near the top. The lock sat to the right of the handle, no different than any back door she had ever seen. She pushed aside the little spike of fear and slid the key in. The cylinder turned as easily as it had at the front. She opened the door a crack. Beyond the threshold, instead of the cracked asphalt of the delivery alley, a set of narrow metal doors hunched in a concrete wall. They were painted a faded gray and lined up in an orderly grid that seemed to go on forever. up and down and sideways. Each had a little slot. Each slot had a tarnished frame where a name could go, but every one of them was blank. The smell of old paper drifted out. Her heart thudded against her ribs. It was the exact smell she remembered from the mailbox lobby of her youth, the smell of envelopes and dust, and the faint metallic tang of the boxes themselves. The light in the narrow room was no direction at all, coming from everywhere and nowhere. When she leaned in to see if any writing marked the name plates, the dim glow shifted just enough to keep her from reading. A sound came from far down the line, not footsteps. A small, steady note, like a finger tapping on metal, repeated with the patience of a dripping sink. Claire pulled the door closed. The sound cut off instantly. She turned the lock with hands that shook, pulled the key out, and walked it back to the bowl. She did not throw it in this time. She held it above, waiting. The keys in the bowl gave a slight stir, a tiny clatter that did not match the small motion of her hand. The whole mass of them seemed to shift, making room, like grain in a bin, settling after something heavy has been dropped in the center. She let the key fall. That night, sleep did not come easy. When she did drift off, she dreamed in fragments. Racks hung with keys instead of pans. The glow of ovens that did not warm her cold fingers. Rows of doors that refused to show her what lay behind them. At some point, the dream shifted. Old mailboxes morphed into little square windows in the bakery's front wall, each with a key dangling in front of it, each key turning slowly, as if trying to decide whether to unlock or not. Behind every pane, something moved. She woke with her heart hammering, the shadow of metal shapes still bright on the insides of her eyelids. The day of the lock change arrived gray and sour. Clouds stacked low over the buildings. The damp made her joints stiff. She went through her work anyway, muscle memory carrying her through. Morning customers came, leaving trails of wet on the floor from their shoes. The landlord stopped in, pointing at the lock and saying something about standards. She nodded, sounded like she was agreeing, even though she only half heard him. When evening fell, the town outside gathered itself into a small, quiet bundle. The lights across the street clicked on in their own time. The neon sign at the corner bar flickered. A few last cars rolled past in the fading light. The locksmith was late. Every time Claire looked at the clock on the back wall, its hands seemed to move too slowly, then jump. She flipped chairs, mopped, and wiped until there was nothing left for her hands to do. The bowl sat beside the register, round and patient. She pulled her phone from her pocket, checked for messages, then stopped herself when she saw the number of calls she had already made. The last thing she wanted was to be the kind of person who nagged a tradesman in a town where everyone talked. By the time the jangle of the bell finally came, her nerves were strung tight. The locksmith turned out to be younger than she expected, with a neat beard and a canvas bag slung over one arm. He apologized for being delayed, said a job over near the grocery had taken longer than planned. His voice had that easy rhythm of someone used to being forgiven for small inconveniences. "No problem," she lied. She led him to the front door, pointed at the lock, then stepped back to give him space. He set his bag down, knelt, and began to work. Tools glinted briefly in the overhead light. Small screws, small plates, the low clink of metal on tile. All of it sounded too loud against the quiet of the closed shop. Out of habit, Claire drifted behind the counter. Her eyes fell on the bowl. It was not full. For the first time since she could remember, there was a space between the keys and the rim. Not much, just the depth of a thumbnail, but a gap all the same. The topmost keys slanted inward, the pile compact but not pressing out. Her skin prickled. She reached out and jostled the bowl slightly. No new keys slid into the gap. Nothing overflowed. Something on the back of her neck tightened. She looked toward the front. The locksmith had removed the interior plate. The lock body sat exposed, a hollow brass block with the cylinder visible. He held the outer piece in his hand, turning it, examining it as if it might confess something. A few of the tools he had laid out looked like slender keys themselves, their ends shaped to coax secrets from metal. He glanced toward her. "You have had this lock for a while," he said. She nodded. "Since she opened the place?" He ran a thumb along the edge of the cylinder. The gesture had something like affection in it. "Some of these older locks," he said, "they pick up a lot of history. You would be surprised what they remember." The way he said it made her chest go tight. Then he chuckled, shook his head, and turned back to his bag. "You probably do not want to hear my shop talk," he said. "I will have the new one in quick." He replaced the cylinder with brisk efficiency, sliding the new body in, securing the plate. The fresh key he cut for her had a neat, sharp bite to it, the edges of its cuts crisp and untouched. When he tested it in the lock, the turn made a clean little click that sounded too bright. "This one will be snug for a while," he said. "They loosen a touch over time. Normal." He handed her a small ring with a few more identical keys on it. The weight of them in her palm felt wrong. Too new, too smooth. She thanked him, took care of the payment, and walked him out. Once the locksmith's truck pulled away and the street settled back into quiet, she locked the front door with the fresh key, then went to the back and locked that as well. The new metal sat cold in her hand, no memory in it yet. The bowl waited. She stood in front of it for a long while. The gap remained, a little hollow in the metal hill. She thought of how the keys had never overflowed, always keeping that same rounded line. How they had seemed to know where they belonged. Maybe they were done. Maybe the new lock had broken, whatever strange rhythm had governed the place. Maybe this was how it ended, not with some grand event, but with a change in hardware and a sigh. She did not believe that. Her own breath sounded loud against the hum of the refrigerators. The light above the counter flickered once, then steadied. She reached into the bowl and pulled out a key. This one was heavier. Its head bore a faint pattern like a flower, the sort that had been stamped on decorative keys years back when people thought of such things as charming. Its cuts were deeper. It looked old. She clutched it in her fist and walked to the front door. The new key waited in her pocket like a straight-backed soldier. The bowl key lay across her palm, familiar now in all the ways it should not be. She slid the old key into the new lock. It went in. That should not have been possible. The locksmith had changed the entire body. She had watched him. Even if the cylinder had somehow been the same brand, the keyway shape would be different. She knew just enough about locks from years of fumbling with them to understand that. The metal throat accepted the key as if it had been made for it. Her hand trembled as she turned it. The cylinder rotated. The bolt pulled back. The sound it made did not match the bright click from earlier. This was lower, thicker, something like a sigh. She opened the door. On the threshold, the air split. To her right, thinner than a sheet of glass, the ordinary street held its breath. The wet pavement, the street lamp with its halo of insects, the dull string of houses. To her left, pressing in at the same time, another street leaned against it, like two pages stuck together in a book. This other street looked like hers might have years from now, or years before, or maybe never. Some buildings stood where she knew there should be gaps. Others were missing, leaving empty lots that had never existed. There were no cars. The sky above showed as that same pale haze she had seen the first time. The air smelled of east and rain again, but sharper now, like the scent from a kitchen where someone had left a batch of dough too long and it had started to sour. The two scenes did not blur together. They sat side by side, each clear, each real. Where they met, a line shivered. The noise from her refrigerators cut across both, a low thread of sound that bound them. Claire realized, with a dull, settling certainty, that the lock was not about keeping people out. It was about deciding which side you belonged on. She could step forward and stay to the right, into her own town, call this whole thing a trick of tired eyes and bad nerves. She could lock the door with a new key, toss the metal from the bowl into the trash, call the landlord and ask him if the locksmith had said anything about strange things, maybe laugh about it and let the story fade. Or she could turn left. She thought about her apartment, with its persistent draft near the windows, the stack of unopened mail on her kitchen table, all of it bills or junk, the way the upstairs neighbor's television seeped through the walls at night, a tinny drip of other people's lives. She thought about how, in the past months, the bakery had begun to feel like the only place she lived. She thought about the keys, about the way every new one arrived with that faint sound, like something settling into its proper place, about the places they had shown her, the silent bakery lit with wrong light, the endless rows of mailboxes with nobody's names, about the people who had come into her shop, talking about losing things they needed, looking at her as if she might somehow help. She stepped over the threshold to the left. The air on that side tasted wetter, a little cooler. It slid along her skin like water from a hose left out in the shade. The town around her adjusted, buildings shifting a fraction as if settling. The line between the two streets remained, a thin vertical shimmer at her back. She did not turn to look at the other side. Some part of her knew that if she did, she might see herself standing there, holding the door open, trying to decide. She focused on the world in front of her. The bakery here looked the same from the outside. Same sign, same front window, same faint smudge where a kid had once pressed a handprint into the glass. Inside, though, she could see differences in the dim shapes. The chairs seemed shorter. The arrangement of tables was off by a chair width, like someone had measured wrong. She realized, with a slow, creeping understanding, that the keys did not just open doors, they opened versions. She backed up until her shoulder touched the frame. Her hand tightened around the key. She felt its cuts press into her skin. Behind her, the bowl sat within sight of the open door. It was no longer full. The keys had receded, the hollow at the top deeper now, the metal lying lower, as if the whole bowl were exhaling. Claire lifted the key and looked at it. The flower pattern on its head had darkened, taking on a faint smear of flour, though she had not touched it to any. She slid it into her apron pocket anyway, feeling its weight against her hip like an anchor. She stepped back into her own side and closed the door. The lock turned with a crisp new click when she used the locksmith's key. The shimmer between the streets winked out. Outside, a car rolled past, the driver glancing briefly at her window, then away. The night pressed in with its usual quiet. She went around and checked the back door. Solid. The office door. The walk-in fridge. All of them resisted the keys she took from the bowl. The metal did not even enter the keyways. The world had retreated to its familiar teeth. Still, each time she tried and failed, when she dropped the key back into the bowl, the others greeted it with a little stir. She began to understand that the bakery itself was the constant. The doors in and out, the locks, the street names, all of that could slide. But the little rectangle of space with its ovens and racks and humming machines stayed, anchored around the bowl like a ship around its mooring. Days went by. She did not test any more keys. There was work to do, and she did it. People came in with their usual problems and small talk. She laughed in the right places, nodded when someone told her their kid had made the team. Their cousin had gotten engaged. Their car had finally died. The bowl held steady at its new level. Sometimes she would glance down and see one of the older, more distinctive heads near the top, the flower pattern or the red smear, but when she looked again, it would be gone, replaced by anonymous metal. Then, on a windless morning when the air outside the bakery sat heavy and dull, the bowl dropped. She heard it before she saw it. Not the sound of ceramic breaking, but the sudden, deep clatter of a pile of keys giving way. She turned and saw the bowl tipped, one side lifted as if a hand had pried at it. The keys had spilled across the counter in a loose fan. She had not touched it. No one had been near it. The ceramic base sat over the edge of the counter, balanced in a way that looked impossible. It should have fallen. Instead, it hovered at the brink, held by nothing she could see. Then, slowly, it eased itself back into place. The keys lay scattered, a few tumbling off the counter to nestle in the glass jar of biscotti. One had fallen onto the floor, where it sat alone in a small circle of flour dust. Claire moved to pick them up, hands steady only because she forced them to be. Metal clicked and scraped as she gathered the keys in her palms. They seemed lighter now, despite their mass. When she dropped them back into the bowl, one by one, the sound of each impact landed differently. Less like coins meeting each other, more like tools placed in slots. She left the last key for last. It was the one from her magnet box, she thought. Or maybe the one with the flower on its head. Or the one she had used for the mailboxes, or some combination. She could not tell anymore. Time had rubbed their differences away. This final key lay in the flour dust, half buried as if it had fallen there long ago and only now decided to show itself. When she picked it up, her fingertips tingled. She did not put it in the bowl. Instead, she carried it with her through the day. It sat in her apron pocket as she kneaded, as she swept, as she wiped rings of spilled coffee from tables. The weight of it marked her with every move. When she reached for change or a pen, she brushed against it and felt the tiny jolt, as if it were reminding her it was there. As the day waned, the town outside drew itself inward. The clouds did not move, but the light around them dimmed. The street lamps came up early, their bulbs humming. A few people mentioned the odd feeling in the air, the way their hair seemed to stand up when they touched metal. At closing time, she flipped chairs, mopped, locked the back. Then she turned off the front lights, leaving only the faint glow from the ovens and the greenish wash from the exit sign near the back door. She moved to the front door with the key in her hand. Her heart no longer hammered the way it had before. It beat slow and heavy, like something resigned. She slid the key into the lock without looking at it. It went in with the ease of a habit. She turned. The lock answered, not with a click, but with a soft grinding sound, like sand shifting. She opened the door. There was no street outside, no split between versions, no shimmer. There were shelves. Tall ones, made of metal, running straight out from the threshold as far as she could see. Keys hung on hooks from those shelves, neatly arranged in rows and columns. Some on rings, some alone. They all had tags now, each with a blank card attached by a short loop. The cards were empty. The emptiness felt deliberate, like a choice. The air beyond the door smelled like the dust between pages in an old ledger. It had a dry stillness that did not match the damp of the night she had left behind. Sound carried strangely. When she shifted her feet, the creak of her shoes echoed in a way that said there were more shelves, more aisles stretching away. No humming from refrigerators followed her here. No tick of pipes. Those sounds cut off at the threshold, like water at the edge of a drain. She did not cross that line. She stood in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, and tried to see how far the shelves went. They blurred into a kind of vanishing point, not because of distance, but because her eyes simply refused to focus past a certain point. Each row looked as full as the bowl had ever been. Each hook carried the weight of something lost. Somewhere between the rows, a sound moved, not footsteps, not that dripping tap note she had heard near the mailboxes. This was the faint, steady clink of metal against metal, repeated with a patient rhythm of breathing, as if someone were walking the aisles, brushing their hand along the hanging keys. She thought of all the people who had come in talking about loss. House keys slipped between couch cushions, car keys left on countertops, gate keys tucked into pockets that had holes in them, mailbox keys, locker keys, shed keys, lives full of openings and closings, locked things, and the means to unlock them. She thought of herself standing in this doorway with a key that had brought her here, a key that might or might not have originally been hers. Somewhere along the line, the difference had stopped mattering. The sound came closer, not straight on, but skimming along an aisle. A faint shape moved between the rows, just beyond where her eyes could make sense of it. Claire stepped back. The key in her hand warmed suddenly, as if someone had breathed on it. She looked down. The metal had darkened, as if in that brief moment the air beyond the door had aged it. She knew, with a clarity that settled into her bones, that if she stepped through and let the door fall in behind her, she would not be able to find her way back. The locks might all accept her key. The shelves might rearrange to welcome her. The tags might slowly fill with lines of script that had something to do with her, or with the others whose keys hung there. The bakery would keep going, on the other side of whatever door remained. The ovens would hum. The bowl would sit beside the register. Customers would come, talk, leave. Someone else would be behind the counter, or no one at all. She thought of that version of the bakery she had seen, lit with wrong light, its racks hung with keys. The one where no heat came from the ovens. The one that smelled like bread and rain and nowhere. She closed the door. When the latch caught, the sound from the shelves cut out. The hum of her refrigerators pressed back in, filling the silence like water rushing into a dry channel. Her own breath wheezed in her throat. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass. The night outside was as ordinary as it ever had been. A couple walked past, talking quietly. A distant dog barked. Somewhere a television light flickered behind curtains. She turned the new key in the lock. It gave that bright, normal click, securing the door against the world. Then she walked to the register and looked down at the bowl. It was empty. Not a single key lay in its chipped white curve. The porcelain showed faint stains from years of contact, little half-moons where metal had rested, but no glint remained. The absence of weight felt heavier than any load it had carried. The quiet that followed was not the simple quiet of a closed shop. It had an aftertaste, as if some larger noise had just ceased. Claire set the key from her pocket into the bowl. It did not clink. It landed with a soft, dull sound, like a stone dropping into dry earth. For a brief second, she thought she saw the other keys there again, just on the edge of her vision. A density, a suggestion of overlapping shapes. Then they were gone. The single key lay alone in the curve of the bowl. She backed away, unwilling to touch it again. At home that night, sleep did not come. She lay on her back, eyes picking out the faint cracks in her ceiling. The muffled television from upstairs throbbed through the plaster. She thought about taking the magnet box from under the railing, just to check, even though she had already done that more times than she cared to admit. In the thin hours before dawn, when the sky outside her windows took on that gray wash that turned every shape into a shadow, she dreamed. The dream was simple. She stood behind the bakery counter, as she always did. The bowl sat beside the register, plain and white, chipped along its rim. People came in and out, some she recognized, some she did not. They spoke, ordered, laughed. Now and then, when someone mentioned losing something, the bowl gave a little sound. In the dream, she never looked at it directly. Whenever she tried, her gaze slid away. But she knew, with that deep dream knowledge that did not require seeing, that the bowl was never empty. When she woke, the taste of yeast sat on her tongue. She went in early, as she often did on mornings when her nerves felt frayed. The sky over the town was a flat, pale band. The street was slick from a late-night drizzle. The front door lock took her key with no fuss. Inside, the bakery greeted her with its usual smells and sounds. Flour, coffee, the low drone of machinery. The bowl sat by the register. For a heartbeat, she thought she might find it full again, the whole strange chapter repeating itself. Instead, it held only the one key she had placed there, lying on its side, the flower on its head catching the first pale strip of light from the front window. She lifted it. The metal was warm. On an impulse she could not quite name, Claire left the bowl where it was and tucked the key into her apron pocket. She went about her morning, measuring, mixing, shaping. The dough under her hands felt the same as it always had. The ovens blinked awake, their elements glowing. The day unrolled, and people came in with their wants and worries. Each time someone mentioned something lost, a key or a card or a name, she felt the faintest vibration against her side where the key rested. A tiny reminder, no louder than a thought, that somewhere there were shelves and rows and tags waiting. By late afternoon, the feeling had settled into something almost like comfort. When Rhea left for the day, waving and promising to lock her own front door for once, Claire stood alone in the front room. The bowl sat empty. The light through the windows had gone the color of old paper. She took the key from her pocket and turned it over in her hand. She could throw it away. She could walk out back and drop it into the trash bin with the flour bags and the torn cardboard boxes. She could drive out to the river and flick it into the murky water, watch it sink without a ripple. She could even mail it to some distant address, send the problem down the line. But wherever it went, whatever it did, some part of her knew the bakery would still be its anchor. The locks, the doors, the thresholds, the slips between versions. They did not just depend on metal. They depended on her. She set the key back in the bowl. It lay there, small and plain. The chip on the rim framed it like a kind of bracket. Then she did what she had always done. She cleaned. She wiped the counters until they shone under the fading light. She stacked trays, flipped chairs, dragged them up along the floor in slow arcs. She locked the back door, feeling the bolts slide home. She turned off the ovens, the lights, one by one, the bakery slipping into shadow. At the front, she paused. Her hand rested on the door handle. The metal under her palm felt no warmer than the air. She turned the new key she had been given, the one that belonged to this version of the street, and heard the bright click. On impulse, before she stepped out, she glanced back at the counter. In the dimness, the bowl's white curve barely showed. The key inside caught the faint spill of streetlight from the crack around the blinds. It glimmered once, like something acknowledging itself, then lay still. The hum of the refrigerators kept going, steady and unbothered. She stepped out into the night, pulled the door closed behind her, and listened for the sound of the lock. The click came clean and ordinary, with no echo. On the other side of the glass, in the quiet of the shuttered shop, the bowl waited. It would be there in the morning, plain and chipped and modest, the key nestled in its curve, ready to greet whoever unlocked the door. Whether that person would be the same Claire who walked away down the sidewalk, or another version who had taken a different key, the bowl did not care. It was only there to hold what no one else knew how to keep.